Hey everybody, Killian HB here, and today we are going to be talking about the metagame in CSGO. I'm sure a lot of people are probably aware of the idea of the metagame and what that means, but I think some people might not totally understand all of the ways in which the metagame develops. I think most people probably think that the only way the meta changes is sort of in the expected way, right? By teams watching demos and thinking up new strats. Like an example would be Inferno, where teams would get smoked out on banana, and slowly the meta changed so that taking aggressive banana control as Ts became necessary as a way to counter that, right? That's sort of the traditional way that the metagame develops. The thing is, much of it is not just teams actively deciding to do new things, but being forced by external circumstances, right? Like, I began to wonder why, as 2015 went on, more and more teams began favoring individual play over team play and strategic play, right? And this was a change in the metagame, this move towards more skill, right? Like, think about it. Envy doubled down on fragging. Fnatic took out their tactical mind and Pronax and brought in Dennis. Mouse Sports removed Gabi and gave Speedy his spot. Sean Gares left Cloud9, he didn't get kicked, but instead of getting a tactical mind as a replacement, they grabbed Stewie2K, pretty unknown guy, very raw skill-based, right? Nip favored individual skill over tactics, burning through coaches like Natu, who wanted to develop more tactics, but they were resistant to that. G2, who now FaZe, built their entire team around the idea that high individual skill alone can create a Tier 1 team. So, looking at it as a whole like that, it's obvious that there's been a huge change in the metagame towards skill-based lineups rather than tactical ones. But why is that, right? I believe that outside factors such as massive amounts of travel and events every week force top teams into ditching their tactics and focusing more on individual play. It has to be said, though, that Envy was a huge contributor to the change, right? They did show that skill alone can win majors. Other top teams saw this, and I think maybe even subconsciously realized that they can do the same thing. They barely have any time for themselves as it is, right? And if they can ditch going over demos and strats and instead just play their individual best, that suits them and their lifestyles really well, right? So think of how many teams, when interviewed at tournaments now, they get asked, right, if they prepared anything special for their opponent or any new strats, anything they figured out, right? And almost exclusively, you'll hear that they are just going to focus on playing their game, right? You hear all the time and time again. And this is because they simply don't have time to develop new strats for every tournament or opponent. So, I started to look back at 2015, last year, right, and think about whether I could find more evidence to support my thesis that these outside factors such as travel and lack of preparation time changed the metagame. So let's think about the teams that focus the most on individual skill. Of course, at the top of that list, there's Envy. And Envy played 152 offline maps in 2015, a pretty massive amount, right? Fnatic, a team who had Pronax for most of the year, but began focusing more on individual play as the year went on, played a whopping 186 maps on LAN. That's more than a full best of 3 every weekend of the year. Every single weekend. TSM, now Astralis, a team that has always tried to find a balance between, tactics and skill, but often fails at that, played 150 offline maps. So it's clear that when you play this much on LAN, which requires travel time outside the actual tournaments as well on top of the actual playtime, that it's impossible to keep up with a strategic game plan, right? The reason for this is that strategies can be countered in many ways, by new strategies or just skill. Outright skill can often only be countered by better skill. And this might seem like a value judgment against tactics, but I think it's quite the opposite, right? Tactics can be relied upon to always have a certain outcome until someone figures out how to counter that, which can often take quite a while. Skill, however, is entirely dependent on tons of factors, many factors. How much sleep did the player get? Are they jet lagged? Is there decent food at the venue? Have they had time to warm up? Is their mood okay? Are they getting along with the other players on the team? All these things can determine whether a player who relies on skill plays well or doesn't, right? So now let's look at the teams who did well with tactics and team play in 2015. Cloud9, who had a sick run in this summer based on counter-stratting come up with by their leader, Sean Gayers, played 113 offline maps in 2015. That's a full 73 less than Fnatic. On top of that, many of those maps were regional American lands, which don't require nearly the travel time, life disruption, or even the preparation that European ones do. Luminosity played only 70 offline maps, a pretty minuscule amount compared to other top teams. I feel like this probably allowed the team's tactical mind, Fallen, to watch countless hours, right, of demos and to think analytically about the game and to work out how to counter the world's top teams, which obviously he's slowly succeeded at doing. Mouse Sports played 83 land maps, giving GodB more study time. Flipside, not a top team by any means, but one that's generally thought of as a tactics-based team, played 74 offline maps. So you can now see how the amount of practice time can determine which teams choose to play a strategic and tactics-based style, and which choose to favor a more skill-heavy approach instead, right? So these choices end up determining the metagame going forward, right? The only big exception I can find is Navi, who played 153 offline maps last year, which is almost dead even with Envious. I can mostly attribute this to them having Starix, who acted as the team's analytical mind long before other teams had 6 men doing something similar. I'm pretty sure that as we see more teams employing coaches and analysts, that we'll see the metagame start to drift more towards tactics once again. But until then, I expect the teams who play and travel most often to be the ones forced into playing, and being forced is what I'm saying here, right? Being forced into playing a skill-based game, while those with the time to analyze will use tactics and try to overcome them. Thanks for watching, guys.